I'm just going to hold this little gadget because I've got a wardrobe malfunction in that it drops a little bit too low and you can't hear me. But anyway, I don't know how often that happens. Thank you very much to Cameron for the introduction, but also for putting on this amazing event. I think he's done a great job, so big kudos to him. But I also wanted to call him out and say that he's stolen something from me today, which was to get the big group kind of selfie, but I will change it around and maybe we'll do a bit of a selfie. So what we're talking about today is how can you improve quality on a project, because we are all individually powerful enough to make some changes that can improve it. I'm not saying that you'll make it perfect and amazing and it's never been better than anything else in the world, but we've got three amazing panelists up here who are going to give us their perspectives. But I wanted to start off by telling you a little story about my wife. My wife buys everything. Like we're early adopters, but she also buys everything. So she bought these things, the Bose sleep pods. Anyone got them? A nod, but maybe you know about it, but you haven't got them? Okay, so she put the Bose sleep pods in her ears 2 nights ago, I think it was. She doesn't sleep very well. And immediately the app pops up with a notification saying, "We're sorry." Bose has actually come out and said that they are sorry. The quality of the Bose sleep pods is not good enough for them to sell. They want them to be returned by December and it will be a full refund. So it's a really good response to a product that's not meeting the requirement. And I don't know why. I haven't read through the background. I don't know if they've told enough about it, whether or not it's hardware, software requirements, whatever it might be. But there's a brand impact. So it's not that, quality is contextual and it needs to be different levels for different things, but you need to think about your customers a lot as well. Anyway, that was just a little story for you. Keep an eye on the detail and maybe there'll be some questions for you at the end as well. But let me introduce the panel for you. I'm going to start with Dean Cornish, who's on my far left. Do you want them to stand up? Yes. Do you want us up on stage? Yes. Okay.
You want us to dance?
All right.
Correct answer.
So I'm going to start with Dean, and I'll do some more introductions as well. But Dean's from Revolution IT, and Dean's is the first topic that we're going to talk about today, which is about test automation, shifting things to the left because it makes it easier, faster, more reliable. So thank you, Dean.
Thank you, Cheryl. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Little toggle on the bottom right. Return it for a full refund. Yeah, it's looking that way. Yep. That sounds better? Great. So my point that I wanted to start a bit of a conversation on was quality, in my view, comes from requirements, it comes from design, it comes very early on in the process. So as testers, we're trying to determine whether those requirements have been successfully implemented or not. And I guess my point here is that over the last, say, 10 years, with the advent of DevOps and closer collaboration with developers, what we're finding is a lot of change has happened inside the testing space. So a domain that used to be typically our own has now become a lot more shared. And that means things like developer-oriented test automation tools are now the standard. That's exactly what we use. Now, I guess I'm going to posit it to the rest of the panel that there's been some really great things that have come from that shift, but also some things I believe may have been left out along the journey. And specifically what I'm referring to is we tend to find ourselves checking things, assuming they work and making sure they work, but not quite so much trying to find the problems, not so much trying to look for things that break a system. I'm curious to know what the other panelists think.
Sorry, just quickly, we haven't introduced the other panellists, and that's on me because I was thinking that we would do it all together. But this is Kelly Wasson. Yep. There you go, I've done so well, from Transpire, and Kelly will also have her own topic to talk about later. And I may as well reintroduce Dave, who was already on earlier, if any of you had a chance to listen to that presentation as well. So Dave is from Tricentis.
No surname.
It's kind of like there's plenty of famous people that don't have surnames, right?
Like Prince.
Like Prince.
Did you want to recap?
Yeah, so I guess to restate the question was, well, what are your thoughts on the impact that development has had, and also where testing could improve going forward in this sort of new world?
Absolutely. I think, and I'm sure a lot of people could relate, is that the activity has always been, I guess, a siloed concept. It's like going from the waterfall model where it was development and then test. And just by a given, it's basically become a necessity that I think more so, as you say, I think it's more the testers having kind of taking a step back and going, hold on, to make my job easier, I think I probably should get involved a little bit earlier and basically start that initial kind of conversation and start that ball rolling in terms of trying to get that interaction happening at an earlier point.
I guess I'd like to ask a question to everyone else because I'm lazy, so I'm getting you all to do my work. Often testers are asked to learn something about development. Like you need to learn actually quite a lot, source controlling, how build pipelines work, operating systems, the bits and bytes of the technology you're operating on. But we didn't really put the question back the other way and ask developers to learn to test. And I think that's something that always made me a little wary when we're talking about everyone now is a dev, essentially, is we risk losing a bit of rigor. The things that we used to do because we had the time, primarily in waterfall, things like proper design of test cases, making sure you had appropriate coverage, making sure negative testing is being done. Much as we say everyone's sort of on the same team, it's kind of like, oh, that'll be taken care of by the BDD or the requirements, or the business will tell us what we need to do. And I almost wonder if we've lost a bit of that test rigor that we used to have. I mean, can anyone name some skills? Like, I'm probably just ignorant here that when we made this shift, we said, developers, you need to learn pairwise testing. No? Right.
Reviews.
Peer reviews of like. Should we just like?
Yeah, sure.
So duet.
How is your singing, by the way?
Absolutely, yours. We're good to go. No. But as you say, like I think maybe there was an extra kind of level of more like kind of peer kind of interaction to kind of validate some of each other's work. But as you say, I think the technology trend has continued, and that there's been testing frameworks that developers have had to become across. But I think from a skill set point of view, I think that the testing world has gone along for the ride, and it's a whole different.
I think we've all probably heard of the Three Amigos as a concept. So,
Has anyone not heard of the Three Amigos as a concept?
Okay, so the Three Amigos as a concept is developer, tester, BA working together as a group at the very start during the analysis phase. So they work together and they pull apart the story or the piece of work that they're about to do. And essentially that's the opportunity for the tester, while they're working in an analysis mode, is to think of all the things they might want to do to break the software, test it. And essentially what that does is it achieves a couple of things. One is it helps the designer or the BA to realize, actually, I have a fundamental problem that this story should not proceed into development because there's some major issues. So that's the fastest point, the earliest point you could possibly find a problem is right there and then. Now, the second benefit is that the developer is a part of that conversation. So in other words, if there's going to be automation that's going to be done, they could say, actually, I think that's a unit test. I can do that very easily, no trouble. Or this one actually is an API test, or this one might be a front-end test or even a JavaScript-specific test. So that's a very strong and positive outcome that I think's happened over the last 10 years. I guess what I wonder is that in our urge to go fast, I guess I'm wondering at what cost. Yes, we're working collaboratively, and yes, when we do things like ATD, where we're essentially signing off a piece of work because the test automation passes, that maybe some of the things that we would have done in the past that may have taken longer might have been more thorough.
I'm going to stop you there just so we can move on in the interest of time. So now Kelly's going to introduce another topic. So these are intentionally quite quick, and you can ask questions hopefully at the end, but also in the breaks afterwards. Clear requirements. kind of important sometimes?
Well, yeah, I think it coincidentally rolls on quite well, because I think a lot of my observation during this transition to, I guess, having those stages of a waterfall cycle is moving to Agile. The idea of documentation, yes, now is just in time, which I totally agree with. I think having reams of documentation at the start is not the best way of spending your time. But I think those initial kind of stories or blocks of requirements are there as more of a high level at the start. When you do a bit of a kickoff, you're basically looking at, okay, how are we going to resource this? How we'll give it some story points. But then when it gets down to the point where you need to go and actually develop this feature, no one really, I don't feel like, from my experience, that extra bit of time that's required to really flesh out that feature doesn't happen as often as you would think. And all the more reason I think that there's my biggest kind of takeaway over most recent times is that, considering that, I guess, technology stack is changing, and it's not so much full stack developers that you're kind of working with nowadays. You've got all the different platforms. You've got your iOS, your web, and your Android, not to mention your backend, and basically they're all designed to do the same thing. So if you haven't had that upfront thinking of what exactly those requirements or that feature should be, chances are they're going to align, hopefully.
So I think it was actually quite interesting when Jet had your donut on screen, and it was 50% roughly that were environmental and configuration type problems. Do I get a prize for that? I'm not sure I remembered what it was.
Pixel 4.
But the other part of it is, in my experience, so many of the, call them defects if you want, but the things that you're finding before you're hopefully going into production are requirements based, because there's a lot of discovery as you go.
So I think I've kind of worked on both ends of that spectrum, on ends where they say, thou shalt not move until you've defined almost every piece of code that needs to be written, by which time the dev's already written the code. And on the other end of the spectrum, where your epics are like, it needs to work for the customer. So I think that
It's a great requirement.
yeah, my favourite was like a $10 million upgrade program where it said it should work like it does now. How does it work now? No idea, but it should do that. Anyway, enough about whinging about tester problems, eh? So I think that I was quite a fan of something that I chatted with James Bark about. He said you should have risk-based documentation. And I thought, I haven't heard that before. I haven't heard risk-based testing. That's a fairly well-known concept. What's risk-based documentation? And he said it's the art of figuring out how much risk there is of people misunderstanding or not knowing how to do the thing that you're doing, and document accordingly. So if you're saying, well, we're going to create a new page for an app that's a fairly well-known application, everything's more or less there, we know we need a new transaction type, go do it, then maybe 1 or 2 lines in a Jira Epic is enough. And then you let your acceptance tests take up the burden of being the supplementary documentation. But if you're doing something new, something that you haven't seen before, and it carries a significant risk of going wrong or wasting lots of time and money, if you do it wrong, then you increase the amount of documentation that you do.
Really.
Okay, so again, in the interests of time, and we should take some questions, but very, very quickly, I'm going to throw to Dave, who does have a second name, but we'll leave him at Prince for
Even I forget it for now.
Your topic that you wanted to introduce was about automation and exploration.
Yeah, so who here knows what an automated test is? All right. The ones that have put your hands down, you just missed like half the day. Who here knows what an exploratory test is? I think half of you are lying. All right, let's find out. Who knows what this is?
It's a Melbourne drinking device.
A Melbourne drinking device containing caffeine, perhaps? Anyone who likes coffee? All right, here you go. Exploratory test is when you're not entirely sure of the outcome, but you need to perform something to find out what's going to happen. And the person on the end of the exploration, heart rate is still coming down, discovered a lot of information in a very short period of time, mainly that there wasn't actually any coffee in that cup. Whereas a functional test, an automated test, and let's be honest, most automated tests are functional for the purpose of this, I'll just cover that vertical, is something where you know what you're looking for and you go out looking for it. And I found too much dogma on both sides. Some people say everything should be automation, exploratory is a waste of time. And some people say exploratory is fast and awesome and automation takes too long and it's high effort. And I was trying to find where the balance is in the middle, and it seems like I could never quite get there. There was either no exploratory testing, which I would hazard a guess some places here you'd say, yeah, we've got exploratory testing, it's called UAT. No structured exploratory testing, and some places are like, no, we only do exploratory testing or testing in production or something because we have a low risk. And I guess the question that I wanted to ask and put out to the panel is, where's the line? Where do you start to say, I don't need to functionally test this. It's better to do it exploratory. And I guess that's where I'll give a couple of seconds for my panelists to mull over the question before dropping a mic arbitrarily on one of them.
And randomly, which one's it?
I should actually, let's do Dean. He hasn't spoken in a while.
I'm sorry, Dean.
It's okay. So I'm just trying to think. It's a good question. I guess, obviously, something that doesn't do anything is a natural place not to functionally test it, of course.
That's a place not to test it.
Well, yeah, that's true. So is the question actually about automation, or is it more about manual?
Well, I kind of overlap functional and automation, because most automated tests are functional by nature. They have to have a discrete goal. Some manual tests end up being exploratory. So that's just kind of a handy Venn diagram rather than a rule.
Okay, well, I would say the most obvious answer would be in situations where the endpoints are out of your control. So where things that may be delivered to you may be of a dynamic nature, and you can't be sure, especially when it's on the first stage of integration and you're not quite sure exactly what the payload is going to look like. It may not be necessarily the payload from an endpoint that you know and are very familiar with. It might actually be something that your team has overlaid or has influenced to output something else as a reaction to that. So things like race conditions, things like security problems and so on, they're not necessarily something that you would automate straight off the bat because you actually want to understand the behavior first.
I'm going to throw a kind of a controversial statement out there. In terms of, I guess, test automation, a lot of, I guess, the terminology that I kind of interchange is more checking, like automated checking, because basically, as you say, you know what the result is going to be. So basically, you're just checking that nothing has changed as a result of executing that test. And so to kind of touch on it, and I think that we're on similar pages in terms of, I think, where you kind of go in and you don't know what the result is going to be, and it's basically using that as an opportunity to exploratory test and have a feel and make sure those requirements, yes, are there, but then you go through those little edge cases that maybe didn't come up during that kind of analysis stage. But basically, you're using that first stage to really understand the feature, and then the next stage is trying to remove those repetitive tasks that you feel like you are doing over and over again and apply them as automated checks. As kind of a hybrid.
Would you consider performance testing exploratory?
Yeah. Okay, you don't need to. In a way, kind of. It depends on, I guess, what type of performance metrics you're trying to actually capture and measure. But if it's just a basic, like, how long does this page take to render? It's the first time you've looked at it. That's kind of could be more of a visual exploratory kind of concept. It depends on what you're trying to monitor, I guess.
Okay. I'm cutting them off again. Sorry, Cameron, just to make sure that we stay on time because we don't want to steal from anyone else's time. I'd like to thank the panellists for coming up here and having a pretty open discussion. I'm sorry, everyone, that you didn't have an opportunity to ask questions, but please feel free to catch any one of these guys out in the foyer after in the next break, I think sounds good. Thank you very much. Cool.